So I was watching the debate was it on Tuesday? I think we caught the last 20 minutes of it or so, and as I'm kind of challenging myself to something beyond political ambivalence, and to be fair, I think I heard more from both Harris and Pence than I've ever heard them cumulatively in my life combined. But there was a point where I was watching, and I think I was supposed to be listening to what they were saying, and I wasn't, where I just had this thought of like, who wants this job? And then I started daydreaming about Biden and Trump, and just had this realization that they're both in their 70s, and I was like, good on you guys, because I do not plan on that kind of responsibility when I'm in my 70s. In fact, for me, it caused me to begin thinking again about, I think more often than not, I'm in this phase right now, and maybe you can relate, where there's just that sense of like, could I just get the job where you stamp things? You know, we've talked about that in the past, like, but as I'm meeting with people and leaders and business owners and small business owners and students who are in school and just teachers and administrators, and it's just like the lack of thanks for working so hard right now has never been higher. Like, everything is complicated, and we're working 100 times harder, and there's 100th of the return. And just talking to a teacher between services she's like, yep, I'm off to work now. I mean, can you relate to that sense of like, hey, I just want to phone it in. Just give me the booth where I stamp things, and then I can't hurt anybody with my decisions, and I can't disappoint anybody with my decisions, and I can't let anybody down. Or can you relate to that at all right now? I don't mean to be too self-loathing, but I certainly can. And I caught myself last week. It was right before the series started, because as I talked about last week, there was some trepidation for me. And it was one of those like pat myself on the back moments, but then like it felt like God was like, you shouldn't be patting yourself on the back right now, where I had this thought, and I think it was actually as I was driving here last Sunday, this thought of like, I feel like I've spent the first 41 years of my life trying to get power, and however many years I have left, I'm going to try to just give it away. And there was this sense of like, oh, good job, Adam. That is such a high and enlightened sense of thinking. And no sooner did I get there, and especially on my ride last Monday, I had this thought of like, that's not really the story that God invites us into. And it made me grateful that late in my teens, I made this decision to try to allow the narrative of the text to frame the way I understand myself and life. Because these people, we can patronize them because they were so ancient and of such a different culture than ours, and they didn't go to the moon, and they didn't do lots of the things technologically we do. But this observation, I think, is profound. And God said, let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish in the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. And we've certainly explored this before, but what occurs to me is something about this God wants to share power. Like, something about this God is not a puppeteer, and he's not a programmer, and he's not the control freak that many of us are, but this God, it just seems from very early in the story, is a God who invites people to share responsibility with God, to share power. And obviously we can cite all kinds of examples as to why that was a bad idea, but this God is constantly giving away power. And so it occurs to me that like just phoning it in isn't really the answer. Not if we're trying to live the Jesus narrative, that it's more complicated than that. But then it occurs to me, like, if that's true, if God wants to share power with us, and if that reflects, lots of the decisions we make, and why we take on difficult tasks, and why entrepreneurs start things, and why teachers teach, and parents have kids, and kids pursue goals in sports and academics and all these things, if that's all true, then it would lead to this second thing that I think is also important, and that is like, well, what if we're also all prone to abuse our power? That if it's true God wants to give us power, then it's also true, isn't it, that there's this warning that we're all quite susceptible to using it for ourselves. And that to me is relevant right now, because that's where we're at. The debates, the controversies, the us and the them, on some level it's God's fault. In fact, I titled this week, Blame God, because this whole sharing power thing was God's idea. Like the political discussion, and that's not to suggest that democracy is or isn't God's thing, but just to say that the conversation about people who have power and how that power is used and them using it poorly, on some level that's on God, because that seems to be his design. And if that's true, then it leads me to a third observation and question. And it's really where I want to drill down. This was, for me, I referenced last week, N.T. Wright's book, God in Public, was positively disruptive for me in this quest of like, okay, Lord, I want to be less ambivalent towards politics, kind of. And it leads to this third observation, though. If it's true that we are designed for power, and if it's true that we're prone to abuse that power, then wouldn't that create a need to speak truth to power? And that's a big emphasis of N.T. Wright's work is on some level. In fact, he says we should stop criticizing the media so much because they're so negative. And he says maybe the church needs to look in the mirror and say the reason they're doing that is because we've become so inept at speaking truth to power. Now, that's its own complicated thing, right? Because on one hand, this is a text, this is a narrative about speaking truth to power. One of the more pointed stories in the text involves King David, Israel's glorious second king. We had it going on. Israel was becoming this local leader. And then all of a sudden, one evening, he looked across the way and he saw a woman who was married to someone else, and he used his power to fetch her. They had sex, she got pregnant, and then he used his power to arrange for the killing of her husband. I mean, he didn't actively kill him, but passively for sure, because he was in David's army, and so he arranged that Uriah would kind of end up on the front lines, and he would get smoked in a battle, and he did. And even then, David didn't see himself in the mirror, but his friend Nathan showed up one day, who was a prophet, and told a story. And more or less, in the end, David had to go like, oh, that's gross. And Nathan went, that's you. Jesus certainly spoke truth to power. I mean, the most famous is that moment in the temple where it seems clear that he was speaking truth to a power who was marginalizing the importance of Gentile people. God had in his foresight set aside this portion of the temple for non-Jewish people, and they set up markets there. And in the same time, he was taking advantage of peasant Jewish people who couldn't bring their own goat to sacrifice because they would find some kind of superficial flaw so that they could upcharge them for one that they bought locally. And Jesus showed up and started throwing stuff around. Jesus spoke truth to power. He looked at some of his closest friends and said, you're like whitewashed tombs. You look so good on the outside, but you're a wreck. He called people hypocrites, which was a Greek theatrical phrase. Like he wasn't even supposed to go to theater, and he knew this phrase, but it spoke to the idea that in theater, the Greeks used masks to make themselves other than what they were. So speaking truth to power it's a thing, and it's an important thing. But I think, and here's where I just want to provoke some thought and conversation this morning, is I think the question that maybe we can help one another by considering is, how do we do that well? How do we do that in a way that's becoming of who God is and the way God calls us to live? Which doesn't imply that we're going to get it perfectly, but like I can respect, and I know several, and it makes me sad, but I can respect like people who are going, Adam, the church should not be doing this conversation. You're out of your lane. And I actually appreciated Justin this week said, this isn't even a politics series. This is a relationship series. But I wonder if the real opportunity is to go, what if we can do something well that our culture is struggling with, and that is speak truth to power. And how do we do that? You know, I feel like it's easy to find, in my opinion, how not to. There's my friend Sean, who pointed this out to me first, but he was the first one to name that this posture that we have right now is not just to say you're wrong, but you're evil. And those are two completely different accusations. And I wonder, to what extent is that the godly way, so to speak, of speaking truth to power? Not that things aren't evil and that the evil never happens, but this week I caught myself asking, I did this quick study of how did Jesus leverage that word evil? Because it's both sides are doing this right now. And I've done it, and you've probably done it, and I just think it's important to name maybe the danger of it. The answer to the question, to what extent did Jesus explicitly call someone out as evil? Of course, he alludes to the potential. I mean, by definition, he would say we're all prone to evil. We're all prone to destruction. But specifically, he looks at people only 5 times in the Gospels. And to give you the short, if you want more data on it, I could email you, or we could go for a walk or talk on the phone or whatever. But really, there's 5 instances overlapping in the 4 Gospels. 4 of them, Jesus says it to his closest friends or the Pharisees. And if you know anything about the politics of Jesus' day, you had the Pharisees and the Sadducees were the big players in the Gospels. And for sure, Jesus might not have been a card-carrying member of the Pharisee sect, but those were his people. 4 of the 5 times, in one case, there's an overlap where the narrator says, once speaking to Pharisees and Sadducees, but 4 of the 5 times, when Jesus calls someone evil, he's calling those who were closest to him evil. Never does he refer to Rome or Romans as evil. Now, does that mean that he never thought that Rome was evil? Of course he saw evil in Rome. But I do think it's this reminder that Jesus reserved his most harsh criticism for those that he had the most relationship with. Not the least, twice he calls somebody the devil. Once it's Judas who betrays him. And another time, in John 8:44, Jesus expounds upon this idea of a people, the Jewish people, being the devil. And you may know that statement was like not single-handedly, but was a major part of the Nazi Holocaust. Taken out of context, Jesus calling someone evil became permission for all kinds of heinous activity. My great-grandma, Grandma Frank, from my dad's side, I knew her. She lived into my adulthood. She was 6 years old in 1917, and she lived in Russia. She was a German woman living in the Volga Valley. And if you know anything about that history, there was a point where the Queen of Russia invited the Germans to come farm the Volga Valley. My grandma was 6 years old in that valley in 1917. And for those of you who are history buffs or not, 1917 marks the start of what we know as the Russian Revolution. It's when Lenin and his Bolshevik party really started to gain a head of steam in what became communist Russia, or what many of you will know as the USSR. That all started because there was a few things going on. And again, I can't speak to the degree to which social upheaval was necessary. I'm sure it was. But what happened was you had an army that was sick of being in World War I who started to push back against the government. And then leaders who came and backed them and formed these kind of militias within them. You had factory workers who were sick of the injustice of their situation, and so they rose up violently against the factory owners. And where it affected my great-grandma, I did a paper on her when I was in college around this very thing. What was when the peasants rose up against the landowners, that brought a whole new level of violence to Russia. And I remember her saying, the part that stood out to me so much, and I know this is anecdotal evidence to the whole evil thing, but it's every time I hear this happen in our culture, I think of my grandma in this story. I'll never forget her saying that when the Bolsheviks showed up at our door with acts of violence and threats of violence and taking, farm implements and all the things that happened, they weren't strangers from Moscow. They were kids that we grew up with, that my dad knew since they were high school boys from our region. And they insisted on things. They took things. In fact, and this speaks to how different materially our world is, I remember her saying that her dad had a trumpet, and they knew he had one, and they insisted that he hand it over, and he wouldn't. And they searched the house, and he had buried it in the backyard in the dirt to hide it from them. And then in the cover of night, he and his wife and kids, I forget how many, got into a horse-drawn sleigh and headed west because one of them, I forget whether it was my grandma's mom or dad, had a sibling in Puyallup, Washington, where they were farming, and so they knew if they could get there, they could immigrate to the U.S. And my grandma's saying along the way she was detained in what were called work camps, but they were really concentration camps. She said they were the same thing that they did to the Jewish people. Her dad actually died in one of those concentration camps. Her mom was this resilient woman who kept going, and eventually they made it. But my grandma, when she boarded the ship, she talked about how she was rolled in a blanket and smuggled onto the ship. And her little sister, Ruth, they cut her hair short like a boy and dressed her like a boy because there was no way as a little girl she was going to get on that ship. And my point is simply this, that I think the danger is if that leader is evil, and again, I think both sides are doing this, then I think we do well to look at history and go, we're not far removed from that leader's people are evil. And the point at which that people is evil, then we've loaded the gun for all kinds of justifiable evil. And if you've watched that Netflix show, I haven't yet, but I have lots of friends who I respect who have, and it seems like he's building on Cal Newport's digital minimalism stuff. But in Social Dilemma, it sure seems I've had two people independent of themselves, one a PhD from George Fox, say, my takeaway from that video is if we don't stop doing social media the way we will, there will be a civil war. Why? Because all the facts are aligned to cause us to say they're not just wrong, they're evil. And so the question I want to ask is, how do we do this in a way that's more becoming of who God is and who we're called to be? And I think, and as soon as I say this, you'll go like, oh yeah, I know this, and I think my job is as much to remind as anything. I think the answer is in Genesis 1. How do we do this? Well, let's look back. Then God said, let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness. We're reminded that the Bible doesn't meet many of our social standards for today. There's many of its different systems that we would call unhealthy. But it was way before its time in almost every instance, and especially here, because there were other creation myths. Some of them predate Genesis 1, but none of them called all of people made in God's image. There were many that said kings were made in God's image. That's convenient. There were many who said men are made in God's image, but there's nothing that we know of historically that said, no, all people. Dallas Willard, one of the statements I remember from him the most is he was asked once, why Jesus? Why is he so important? And he said, because there's not another person in human history who gives that much dignity to the individual human person. I wonder if the tension, and I really believe the title of this series, I wonder if the tension in this is holding in tension our responsibility to speak truth to power, with bearing in mind that said power, no matter how much we do or don't agree, no matter how dangerous we think it is or isn't, is an image bearer of God. And somehow we have to navigate those things. Jesus in Matthew 5, my friend Daryl pointed this out this week, and I was like, man, you're right, this is it. In Matthew 5, you've heard that it was said to those of ancient times, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you, it's like Jesus is going, how do we get to murder? Oh, here's how. But I say to you that if you're angry with a brother or sister, you'll be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you'll be liable to the council. And if you say, you fool, you'll be liable to the hell of fire. I can't claim to completely understand the nuances of what Jesus is doing there, but this much seems clear. That the answer to the question, how does a person get to murder, is they first and foremost tell themselves that that person is fundamentally not of God, that they lack any value. My friend Fred, who's met with more married couples than anybody I know, he likes to say, nobody cheats on their spouse without killing them first. Which isn't to say actually a literal thing, it's a figurative thing that we have to tear down a person's inherent value. What does it look like to hold in tension? I fundamentally disagree with this party or this leader, and they are image bearers of the holy. And what if one of the gifts that we could give as a people trying to be formed around the mind of Christ is to somehow live with a less binary mindset? In fact, I've been studying this thing for personal stuff. I'm working on some stuff personally, which I try to do. My hope is that series are born out of my own learning, not because I need a series. And there's some stuff that I'm working on for January, and one of the phrases that keeps coming up over and over again, and it weirds me out, so I've been researching it, is this idea of non-duality. You may have heard it. It's one of those phrases that's used by multiple religions and multiple spaces, and therefore it's easily accused of being all kinds of things that are scary to Christians, and some of them rightly so. Then I was working on it again this week, and I realized, wait a minute, I think when Justin talks about being non-judgmental, which he has a lot of training in that, this is what he's talking about. And then Hannah weighed in, and she's like, this is the non-binary stuff. And she's going to talk about a book next week that just really challenges us to think through some of these things. But here's really what non-duality is it's the suggestion that nothing is either all good. There's my own generalization. That'd be ironic. I'm using a generalization to disown generalizations. But that rarely is anything either all good or all bad. It's challenging us to nuance it. I think of Jesus as a representative of this. Like, did he really think that the tax collectors and sinners that he stood up for were that good, that they were all good? Or was he at times making a point? Like, listen, you guys put these guys in the good category and these guys in the bad category, and I'm here to tell you it's not that simple. See, non-duality is the sense of not everything is a 0 or a 1 or a good or a bad or a right or a wrong or a black or a white. Richard Rohr, who does some work on this, and sometimes I love Richard Rohr and sometimes he scares me, but here's his definition of non-duality. He says the dualistic mind is essentially binary, either or thinking. It knows by comparison, opposition, and differentiation. It uses deceptive words like good, evil, or descriptive words, like good, evil, pretty, ugly, smart, stupid, not realizing there may be hundreds of degrees between the two ends of the spectrum. What if the invitation here is to go, wait a minute. Not everything, very few things, are either all good or all bad. I heard one person speaking to this week on Pete Enz's podcast, and it really helped me. He said he likes to say to people, because oftentimes the caution here is, okay, so what you're asking me to buy into is relativism. And this person was like, no. just complicated non-relativism. And he said this, what are the numbers between 6 and 10? Well, of course, we all know enough about numbers to know, well, the answer is actually there's an infinite number. So there's lots of shades of gray. There's lots of nuances. There's lots of need for conversation. But here's the good news to those of us who care deeply about truth. 5.99999 is not one of them. And neither is 120. And that we call theology, that we call virtue and ethics and morality, that we call complicated conversation and interaction and finding truth in the tension. But what if part of the way we could serve ourselves and others is go, wait a minute, I don't have to adopt a binary, dualistic, judgmental perspective of this person or this idea or this issue. I read this week about a computer, a complicated computer that took the phrase, the spirit is willing but the body is weak, and they asked this computer to translate it into Russian and then back into English. And what they were trying to expose was the limitations of rational thought. And here was the translation they got back in English. The vodka is agreeable, but the meat is too mushy. Which I feel like could become kind of a fun family idiom, okay, you're being binary. The vodka's agreeable, but the meat is too mushy. Because what's going on here, obviously, is straight logical thinking doesn't have the ability, in straight rational thought, something is either A or not A. It can't be A and B. What if the permission and the challenge of non-binary thinking is to not accept those polarized ideas? I think we've made great headway as a church in the last 50 years in the way we process divorce around those ideas. I think we've got examples where we've done this and we've done the hard theological work of this. What if we've got to do some of the social work and some of the political work of all of this? Here would be an example, and if this is too much, then I'm sorry, but to me this is the epitome of it. Tomorrow is what many of us grew up with as Columbus Day, and today is Indigenous People Day, and I'm not trying to offer comment on that at all, but here I think would be the way binary thinking would push our buttons, would be to go, were the indigenous people of North America, were they all good? Were they all bad? And were the white Europeans who showed up, were they all bad? Were they all good? See how prone we are to just go one direction or the other? I would love, wouldn't it be refreshing to see a political ad? And I'm sure there's reasons why this is impractical, and I'm politically stupid, so here goes my best attempt to solve the problem. But wouldn't it just be refreshing to see an ad that said something like, Steve Bullock he's a dedicated father and husband and pretty honest Montanan, and he gets an F from the NRA. And Steve Daines, apparently got to be Steve Daines, I have to think, has this strong leadership ability, and he's a successful entrepreneur, and his policy is such that he's okay with exporting jobs to China. Wouldn't that just change the game if it wasn't like you either have to accept that this person is all good or that this person is all bad? I was watching that VP debate, and I think because I was thinking about this binary stuff, at the very end, they had that, 13-year-old girl from Utah who they read her question, which I thought was a brilliant idea. And then I caught myself daydreaming about what would I ask if I could? And I can't claim that this is embedded in my character, but because this is kind of the meditation of my heart in this season, I thought, how awesome would it be if you could ask Senator Harris, hey, Senator Harris, what's something about the character or the policy of Vice President Pence that you actually really love? And Vice President Pence, what's something about Harris's track record as an attorney that you actually are really proud of? And what would that cost us if we could play the game in those kinds of less binary ways? I mean, maybe we need to do a better job of going, hey, I'm against this person, but here's all the reasons that I actually like them. And I had this idea, and I'm not going to do it, but of going what? Because I don't want you to have to identify who you're voting for or if you're voting, but wouldn't it be refreshing if we went okay, so someone who's going to vote for Trump, okay, stand up and speak truth to him. And someone who's not, stand up and express an area where you're grateful for him in the last 4 years. And conversely, someone who's not going to vote for Biden, say something positive about what you know Biden to be. And someone who is, speak truth to that person. Isn't this, I know it's radical, but Jesus is difficult, right? That's the whole thing. Think of the way he ended a major section of his teaching in Matthew 5, or at least the editor ends it, I suppose. You've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that they may be children of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. Doesn't it feel safe to assume that on some level what happens when you pray for somebody that you're angry towards or that you don't like or that you fundamentally are scared of is that if you're talking to a father about their son, if you're talking to a parent about their child, wouldn't that just inherently remind you that you may not see worth in that person, but somebody does? Which I don't think means that we all have to become vanilla in our convictions or our beliefs, but maybe that's where the church has this opportunity to represent a third kind of way. Not one completely ambivalent and disillusioned and uninvolved, but altogether more willing to embrace the tension of speaking truth to power and bearing in mind that that power and that party and that group of people is made in the image of God, and they can't possibly be all bad any more than they can possibly be all good. Thinking of the cross, and this is where I felt challenged in my own, okay, Lord, I just want to phone it in. Jesus, the simple way would be to say Jesus just phoned it in. He just said, I'm going to give all my power away. But I think if we nuance it, we go, that's actually not at all what Jesus did, is it? He didn't give his power away. He fundamentally used it on behalf of others. The cross, in my view, is not about a Jesus who was brought to a place despite his best intentions. It's about a Jesus who willfully chose a path that, there was outside forces as well, sure. But Jesus is the one that was like, listen, if you want me to call down armies from heaven and squash you like a bug, I could do that. It's a way of using power that's not uninvolved, but that finds purpose and value in self-giving love. So let's grab your communion elements. It's going to be noisy for a second. If you have a mint to open, now would be a good time to do that as well. So thanks to Hannah and her hard work, you've got a ketchup container. And sorry, it's not wine, it's juice. We're working on that. Just not sure how we do that and don't go to jail. So everybody in your party should have enough for a little ketchup container full of juice. Not to mention lunch. And then you've got your bread, and I'm still learning how to do this, but I told Hannah, we're never going to do communion that way again. And she's like, that was for half of the room? I don't want to rush you. So on the night Jesus was betrayed, he took bread and broke it and said, hey, this is for you. This is my body broken. This is the value of power used in these ways. We've talked for years about communion as this reminder of not only Jesus' victory on the cross over evil and sin, yours and mine, but it's a mirror of how to live. So let's take that together. I got a big piece. And then he took wine and said, this is my blood, poured out for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Let's do that. Jesus, thanks, Lord, that the high road for you was not just usurping the system and not doing power at all. It wasn't just phoning it in and living in a booth by yourself where you couldn't hurt anybody. But it was a decisive statement about how power ought to be used, coupled with the value of people. So God, I think of teachers and entrepreneurs and business leaders and students and really, Lord, everybody in the room who's in this season where it's just never been more thankless to have any kind of decision-making ability or creative capacity. But Jesus, that we could be a different kind of light, a different kind of power, and that we would perpetually remind one another that our vocational role is to serve others. And then Jesus, in the midst of this political conversation, that you'd slow us down enough, and even if it just requires reflection after the fact, to live within the tension that speaking truth to power is a responsibility that we all have, and especially that the church has, and affirming the God-given dignity and worth of every person is also a function and a role that we have. God, may we in our offices and in our conversations and in our social media and just the comings and goings of life, may we represent a way of being human that certainly others are doing well, but that maybe we could join them in modeling. We love you, God. Amen.
If you would like to learn more about Narrate Church, find us at narratechurch.org or look us up on Facebook and Instagram.